Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Bridge, where medicine meets the arts. This podcast comes out of our 9-week narrative medicine program called The Bridge, where each week we explore what it means to listen and read and live with more attention. Last week, we were talking a little bit about the third space, or the intersubjective space, where meaning is collaborated on and where meaning is decided on. We asked what part of an artwork belongs to the artist and what part belongs to me, the person engaging with the artwork, and what part belongs to both of us together. This week, we're carrying that idea forward into figurative language. So if last week was about where meaning happens, this week is about how meaning happens, specifically by looking at the language itself. Metaphors and symbols, for example, give pain a shape, a taste, a texture. They help us feel that in our bodies so that we can kind of start to put ourselves in another person's shoes, even as we recognize that we'll never completely understand the lived experience of what they're going through. So our big question this week is, how does figurative language help people share experiences that are too big, too raw, or too complex to say directly? And today I am joined by the lovely Fiona Gardner, a physiotherapist from New Zealand who has built a career from sports medicine to complex pediatric pain, while also pursuing research that centers on that lived experience. She's also a writer, hiker, and someone who knows the power of stories both in and out of the clinic. Hi, Fiona.
Hi,
Thank you
nice
so
to be
much
here.
for joining us. Hi. So I'd love to just get started by asking you if you could tell us a little bit about that path that your career has taken you on, from rugby to working with pediatric patients and their families.
Um, actually, looking back, it feels like a very inevitable pathway that sort of happened. Uh, so physio, um, I'm clearly not American. I'm from New Zealand. In New Zealand, our training is all undergrad, and there's a lot of the public can seek help from a physio directly. So you can go straight to, as under your insurance, straight to physio. We can diagnose, we can ask for investigations, so things like that. So a lot of the public would think of physio as a the person that runs onto the all black field, with the magic spray and in a sports setting. So that's probably why I pursued that. But then, I started becoming more interested in the not just the sprained ankle, but
Mhm.
the body attached to that, the world that they lived in. So
Mhm.
I from there I went into occupational health, and in occupational health, then it's very much about the story. It's about your workplace. It's about your home. It's about your family commitments. It's not just about your work. And the barriers were always um, uh, bigger than the injury. And that really sparked my interest. And it was often people who had weird pain. Uh, and
Mhm.
um, how did that sit with all of the players in their world, and how did they navigate world? And so when my youngest, who's now 11, went to school, I did a big reappraisal of where's life going to go. And that's when I moved completely into pain, did some more postgrad study. And that's when I started working with complex pain, particularly in children. So I'm inherently nosy. I like to know about people's stories. Um, and so I think it's really important. I now have a real passion about the stories that we tell ourselves about pain at a social level,
Yeah.
and I think we can change that as a metaphor, as the language we use, and the way that people with pain have to live in our world. Yeah,
Well said.
it was a very long answer to a really short question.
That was a huge question, and I think you did it succinctly.
There's
I
the blank page.
we both come from a background in pain science. And
Mm,
I know a lot of folks in our cohort this semester don't have a
yeah.
same background. So I'm hoping maybe you could take a moment just to talk about the relationship between pain and story from a pain science perspective.
Um, so, I mean, I think one of the real problems that people have with pain is it's often invisible. Um,
Yeah.
and so they are trying to paint a picture of what life is like for them, why they can do something on one day, but they can't do it on the other day, or
Right.
why maybe they're believed or not believed. And a lot of the language that we use around pain is more an acute setting. So that, I have, put my hand in the fire. I've got really sore pain. And a lot of the language around it is, it's an insult, it's a battle. It's like they're kind of these in the moment, like I'm going to fight back, and I'm going to conquer this pain.
Right.
And then as pain persists and as it becomes weirder and becomes more about the things that we're losing in life because of the pain.
Yeah.
It's not just about the pain. It becomes about I can't engage at school. I can't sleep. I can't pick up my grandkids.
Hmm.
I can't hug the people I want to hug, or I'm losing all of who I thought I was because of this pain.
Hmm.
And when we can know the science around that, we know that, 1 unit of damage doesn't equal 1 unit of pain in our brain. It's not like that. And the longer that pain kind of carries on, the more difficult it is to explain for the person experiencing it. And
Absolutely.
the more times they've tried to tell people and gone unheard.
Right.
And so the risk of each time that they tell that story and they get diminished or misheard or misrepresented, the risk of them sharing that story again becomes higher. Um,
Absolutely.
mm,
Absolutely. This actually, I'm jumping the gun here, but this reminds me a lot of a discussion that you brought up on the discussion boards about that phrase from the poem we're going to be looking at today, Audre Lorde's Coal, where she says something along the lines of the adders were breeding in my throat, and how you felt like that was the loudest image in the poem was the image of silence. And
yeah,
it seems to me to be very related to this experience of not being able to have your pain comprehended or heard or acknowledged, and how that can be kind of a real embodied feeling of violence, and that in itself can exacerbate pain, you know?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. It blew
yeah.
my mind when I learned that pain was actually a protective structure, that it's not so much your body, telling you how badly it's doing at getting better. It's very much your body signaling to you what it needs in order to protect itself. And
Absolutely. Which
yeah,
makes sense when you've got your foot in a fire, right? That actually you need some kind of like a measure to say, oi, we're doing ourselves damage and we need to remove our foot from the fire. But after its rest, after those tissues have started to pass, there's no protective benefit anymore. Um, yeah.
right. Yeah. And I have a partner who's dealing with chronic pain right now. My mother has advanced lupus and deals with terrible pain. And it is heartbreaking to see people you love hurt. And even more heartbreaking coming from a narrative. I'm convinced that the one downside of studying narrative medicine is that it really it gives me a bit of a chink on my shoulder when I interact with doctors and they don't listen now. It makes me even more furious because I'm like, but you can. Um, and I see what my husband and my mother go through, just trying to be acknowledged, just trying to have someone actually see them and what they're going through. And it's really quite hard to do, at least here in the States, where everything is
Yeah.
very, very commercialized and siloed, and everybody shunts you to
Silos.
the next person, So I'm really happy to have you here and this whole cohort here studying with us about how we can become better listeners for folks in pain. So let's turn to the text together. Normally I put people in the hot seat and ask them to like do a high level overview of what this piece is, but it's kind of impossible to do with Cole. Like, what is the plot of this very complex poem? So I thought we could actually get started by listening to Audre Lorde read it herself. It's not terribly long, and it's just so beautiful to hear it in her own voice. Speaking of
Yeah, I agree.
the voices of people uh, from their own position of lived experience. Um, okay, hopefully the sound works here. Here it is.
The next poems are from Cole. These are earlier poems. The book itself was published in 1976. Cole. I is the total black being spoken from the earth's inside. There are many kinds of open, how a diamond comes into a knot of flame, how sound comes into a word, colored by who pays what for speaking. Some words are open, like a diamond on glass window singing out within the passing crash of sun. Then there are words like stapled wagers in a perforated book, buy and sign and tear apart, and come whatever wills all chances, the stub remains, an ill-pulled tooth with a ragged edge. Some words live in my throat, breeding like adders, others no sun. Seeking like gypsies over my tongue to explode through my lips like young sparrows bursting from shell. Some words bedevil me. Love is a word, another kind of open. As a diamond comes into a knot of flame, I am black because I come from the earth's inside. Now, take my word for jewel in the open light.
Wow. So in our close reading of this poem together, we really focused on our senses. Words or images and how they conjured taste, touch, smell, sound, how we could feel them in our body, even more than we could just see them or understand them. Did any of these images really help you feel the poem in your body in a different way? And did anything in just hearing Audre Lorde read her poem aloud help you feel the poem in a different way?
So you sort of touched on it earlier that I found it really interesting that the most sensory experience for me was her talking about the adders, was talking about that like vile, like writhy, skin creepy
Yeah.
sense of uh just just yeah, violence, sinisterness, something really that we snakes, we perceive them as quite, as evil. Except for when they're included in medical symbols, when it's a whole different thing. But there was something about that phrase that just turned my skin, and the breeding made it feel like it was amplifying, like it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So in the unsaid, that it was that there was that there was a growing tide behind those words that went unsaid.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that, and it actually probably something the course is teaching me about the way that I read is I don't read in a potentially sensory way. I don't necessarily think about how the words might feel in my mouth as I say them, where in my mouth I'm going to say them, or things like that. So I know that there are lines in there where the words are much softer, and then you get to sort of perforated and ragged and stapled, and they're all much harder. So there's sort of a pacing there, and so then when listening to her, and she changes, her pace is slow, and New Zealanders, we notoriously talk very fast, so everything feels a little bit slow to me, but she slows down a lot in certain phrases, particularly at the end.
Right.
It's like it gains weight, like it gets heavier for her. And so that for me was quite the sort of an interesting sensory sort of part of it. And then there's just there's a lot of talk of heat, you know, and the core of the earth, and the sort of, and heat is always an angry, you know, it's red face, that's the emoji, right, for being angry. There's sort of the heat, the growing heat that sort of bursts out. But then also the sun is where the light happens, and where, you know, she presents the jewel, she presents her words, presents her ideas. So yeah, the from a sensory perspective, for me, it was touch that was the thing. It was the creeping adders, it was the warmth of the sun, like a positive, you know, it's out there in the world, as well as the heat of the earth.
That's so interesting because now you're making me think a lot of you've already mentioned Anna's post about the inside outside kind of there's a lot of what's inside trying to get out, and a lot of what's outside trying to get in at the same time. There's this kind of a push and pull action happening between a lot of these symbols that you're noticing. And I also really love that you point out how she slowed down toward the end, specifically at that last quatrain beginning, love is a word, another kind of, oh, I mean, the real gravity, I think, is the word you used. It's a great word. And in that last four lines comes that great what I think you framed as a kind of massive shift of agency and power, where she says, I am black because I come from the earth's inside. Now take my word for jewel in the open light. I'd love to talk to you about that shift in power and agency that you noticed. In your discussion post today, you contrasted it with a line earlier in the poem where she says, um, she calls it spoken from the earth's inside. I is the total black being spoken from the earth's inside, the passive structure of that sentence, I is being spoken, versus the active structure of I am black because I come from the earth's inside. And I'd love to hear about how this declaration of agency maybe mirrors or uh, resembles agency, how families or children claim agency in pain situations and the language they use around pain. It does anything.
That's a big question.
Right. Well, here, let me, I'm notorious for these making questions impossible. Let me ask something more simply. Do you notice families or children using more active structure in the way they talk about their pain as they are at any point versus a passive structure? And what does that tell you about where they are in their pain experience?
Yes, would be the short answer. So, in my my last role in pediatrics, we were a nationwide, like a tertiary complex pain team. So typically, by the time a family had got to us, the child had probably had pain for about 3 years. So they'd probably been like maybe 1.5 to 2 years to get a diagnosis, and then or even get to referral, and then finally to get to us. So there's an interesting sort of desperation in telling their story. They're really like, and sometimes just sort of pours out. But because of that, we would have our whole team for maybe 2 hours sit and listen to the story, which is, you know, it's a hard thing to hear often. And I think often the child has one way of speaking of it, and then the adults might have another. And then sometimes there might be 2 different ones between mum and dad, or, you know, and sometimes none of those would match. So I'm thinking, I think we socialize the way that we think about or talk about pain a lot. So the adults would tend to be more, often the mum would say we, so the mum would use we as we do this and we do that. And maybe that's just because they're the person that's going to lots of appointments and lots of situations. Often it is partly their experience as well. Because I think with children, the whole family is involved. Well, it's always involved. You're talking about your husband and your other family members. So it always is a whole family experience. But I think often with an unwell child, there's one partner or one parent who's typically not working by the end of that time, by the time people get to really significant help. So it is a family experience because it's completely changed the dynamic of their family. I think children are much more likely, they use more story as they would happily say, if you said, when is your pain worst? They would quite happily say, it's when I'm in Mr. Smith's class. Or it's, or they would say, oh, it makes my knees feel all funny, and you don't get adults turning up and saying that. They say, they often report what someone else has said. Oh, my first doctor told me that. And then they'll tell that story. They actually often, it's like they don't trust their own story by the time, that maybe that they have all these doubts. Maybe if I did something differently, maybe if I'd not done that X, Y, Z. So that's not answered your question at all, but I definitely think that there is a difference, and trying to find that framework, that story that everyone can see themselves in and move into. And for children, a lot of pain is worst around those sort of tween years, those sort of formative sort of 10 to 13, maybe 15. And a lot of that at that age, they're individualizing their story from their parents anyway. And so they want their story to look different to what mum and dad thought.
Right.
Right. That's like part of it, part of the whole thing. And so it can be really difficult. It's sort of like everyone's got a different script. But then I definitely think that the agency, the external, I have this injury because the bus crashed into me. I have this because the surgeon mucked it up. I have this because 9 clinicians before you haven't heard me. And that fury that comes with that sense of injustice. And we know that injustice delays people's recovery or back to a meaningful life, right? That if they have that sense of no agency but having been wronged, then that holds them in a really stuck place. Whereas if they can have a voice and if they can direct some of it themselves instead of telling them what to do, if we can listen and then change a tiny bit of the story or a what if, then that gives a real power and a voice back to them in an agency to be able to maybe do something slightly differently or differently to how they've been told, or just in a more accepting way.
Yeah.
But certainly, like, the idea is obviously to try and empower is a terrible word, because why have they lost their power in the first place? But to provide opportunity, provide them with a voice to say, this is what I think I want to do. This is how I see it going. Like, often no one's asked, no one's ever said, if this was up to you, what would you do?
Yeah.
Would you go to bed for 6 weeks and then bounce back out or rejuvenated, or would you, what would you do?
Absolutely. I have an almost 3-year-old daughter, and I try to keep up with the good approaches to parenting, and I read often that kids in general, not just toddlers, but just children in general, nobody really asks them their opinion about things. They're told what to do a lot, and they hear no a lot. So of course you want to push back and you want to resist. But how empowering is it to be given options rather than just saying this is what you're going to do now? And I love how you set up this you said children tend to use personal stories about their pain, whereas adults tend to use others' stories to describe their child's pain. Here's what
Yeah.
doctors have said, here's what Dr. Google says, here's what our insurance people say, or whatever it is, they have, a big adult story that doesn't really include the child's story. And I was going
Mm.
to ask you, how do you help get them to that directive place? But you've already answered the question, ask them, what do you think you should do? How can I help you get what you want, and how and or what your body wants? And I just think that that's such a solid framework for dealing with people, not just children. Um, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Do you
That
do you find that it's harder to get kids to that place than it is adults, or easier?
I think it's easier to get the kids there
Easy.
because they're not as entrenched. I mean, children are inherently more flexible, right? So they're neurologically more flexible.
Mm,
They are learning. They've got all this synaptic pruning happening. They're laying down new pathways and deciding which ones they
totally.
want to get rid of, and they're in this very flexible. And you
Totally.
see that in conditions which in adults would be the slow burn, but in children come and go really fast. And we see that. I'm sure you see that in your 3-year-old. They crash and burn, they vomit, they're burning up with fever. And then the next day they're like bouncing around fine. It might even be a couple of hours later they're bouncing around fine. It's infuriating. But they are, but it's also wonderful, right? Because
Yeah.
they're just
Resilient.
sponges.
Yes.
Yeah, they just bounce back
Totally.
until they don't. And I think that the parents they assign more meaning and they future trip more. So but they have to go to school because this is all this, and suddenly they've got this child in their 40s and they've predicted all this thing of what's happening right now and the impact of that. So they do a lot more of the what will happen down the track.
Right,
But
right.
they've been socialized to think of pain in certain ways and to think of what a child is meant to do with their life. And there's a natural divergence in that anyway. So I think the children typically, especially if they're young, it's easier, unless to change that, because you can disprove things more easily as well. Like, it is their body, so they're experiencing it. So you can be more curious, and I wonder what happens if, and you know, um, try things out. Whereas, as you say, like for the adults, often the child isn't really part of the story,
Mhm.
and so they can't experience it. They can't see, and so then you've got often it's demonstrate via the child, and then the parent can see what change might happen. But it's really difficult because ultimately they're their caregiver, they're the person who's passing on all of their beliefs and truths and stories, and that without and in the massive periods of time that there's not a clinician,
Right.
so they're having to really rewrite some stuff in the way that they think about things, and the way that they want to keep their child safe. They think they're doing the right thing, and often they are, maybe with a tweak. But it's all well intentioned, isn't it?
Yeah, this discussion is just making me much more conscious of how complex this whole project of the third space is. We were talking
Mm.
in our podcast about the third space and the intersubjective space as if it's only between two people, as if it's only between patient and provider where meaning is collaborated on. But that patient and provider also come with, 2,000 different iterations of their own inner child who are a part of these conversations,
Yeah,
own
yeah,
experiences,
yeah,
and they're all
yeah,
debating, you know.
yeah, absolutely.
And there's no I guess hotter third space than between a parent and a child, so what yeah, I can only imagine your job must be part family counselor, part pain professional, part you must wear so many different hats from a social and emotional perspective as well as just treating, the physical body.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of hats, and I guess it's quite good for the ego because you can't be an expert. You've never met this many moving parts before,
Yeah.
And so often in medicine, there's the model of the sort of the white coat, and this sort of this top-down instructive way of treating, and there's that clinician has a very limited space in chronic pain, especially in children's chronic pain. I mean, of course, there's the medical interventions, the prescribing, and all of those things, but ultimately, it's finding a way to pass on our very limited pain knowledge. I mean, really, in terms of rehabilitation, we don't know very much, but what we do know, and to try and to find a way to put it into their story, to think about things in a different way, and maybe, So it's very much a be there, be curious, be humble. They often know. That's the interesting thing. It's listening for that one line of, when is it better? Or the day that it was great, or I did this, but it was awful, but it was totally worth it. And listening for those moments where that's where the door is. That's that moment of, okay, I can see a little snippet in everyone's story that's that moment, that's that beginning point that we can all step into and agree on. And then we can, do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. It reminds me a lot of motivational interviewing, finding that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, finding that part, that one little bit that tells you what they actually want, and then helping them achieve it. help the way through that door. That actually reminds me a little of something you wrote on the discussion boards, and forgive me for mangling the word, Taonga?
Oh, Taonga. Treasure. Yeah.
Yeah. You said that in Maori, Taonga means not just a jewel, but also history and language and place. And it was such a productive discussion for, we were discussing what jewel means in the context of the poem, but also just about how much words, how much power and context a word can have, that it really can be a little one, all you need is that one little jewel, and this whole history opens up. I love that. Do you mind talking a little bit about Taonga and the way that you see the jewel or language or history as a part of pain care?
Sure. So Taonga is kind of literally is a treasure. So before British colonizers came to New Zealand, their Māori was a purely spoken language, so that was never written down, and so it was very much had as a history of storytelling, and that's how culture was passed on. Māori have a very strong link to the earth. Don't really believe in ownership of the earth. It's more about taking care of it for our future generations. And as part of some of the sort of the righting some of the wrongs of our founding treaty, a tribunal was sort of put forward, and Taonga became kind of a part of representing what's important, and language is one. And certainly if you think about a lot of cultures around the world, like removing their language, particularly removing the language of the children, has been part of a process of colonizing. And so Te Reo Māori is the spoken word Māori, and it's really beautiful language, actually, and which embarrassingly I speak very little of, but I'm working on that. But I think it probably harks back to that being unheard, that injustice of having your voice removed, and who gives you permission to speak? There's that line in Cole where she talks about, what did she say? Paying for or is it about paying? Who are colored by who pays what for speaking? And it's like such a brilliant line in terms of who says, like, who's got the power to say you can speak now, and then also what's the consequence for the person who's invited in to speak or speaks uninvited. Our voice is so important. And and yeah, on the discussion board we were talking about diamonds, and then her flip to jewel at the end, and it has a, diamond is the sort of the earth, the quality of it exists in nature, but everyone had a different but shared idea of what jewel is, and about how it's something that we've assigned importance. It's got that kind of cultural, it's almost got, sometimes it's sort of a celestial, it's what monarchs wear, or it's what it might have, religious connotation. I was talking to my daughter, and she was talking about how jewels have been used in sort of feminist, sort of, for women in certain cultures. If you can't get a bangle off, then they can't take that off you. That's yours. It gives you power. It gives you an exit. It gives you some kind of, and so the change to jewel, and that's something that's precious and revered and looked at. A jewel is there to be admired and looked at. And I didn't, embarrassingly, perhaps because I'm not from the United States, and so the civil rights movement, while I know it's probably not as familiar, and I don't feel it in my bones, as say in a lot of you guys would, but where was I heading with that? Just that I didn't know any of her work, and the more I looked at different poems of hers, the more they speak to each other. So I know that this was part of a collection that she put in, and in her other work where she talks about poetry is not a luxury, and she talks about that there are no new ideas, just sort of ones that we've forgotten, and that in carving them out, and carving them from the world, that that we hold them in our consciousness, so we can't forget, and I thought that a jewel, that's what a jewel feels like. It's something that marks something important, and that her words are important, and the love that she is talking about, and openness and willingness to listen, and all of the things that open means, out in the open, being seen, is really important. And that's what I don't want to assume I know what she was meaning, but that we have to hold those ideas in an open space, like actively hold them in an open space if anything is going to change ever in the world.
Gorgeous, gorgeous response. I am always so shocked by how you guys can take my crazy mangled questions and then just polish them and turn them into that was a tour de force.
Welcome to the inner workings of my brain.
Brain.
That was very cohesive to me.
That was beautiful. And there's so many things that you said that I want to pull out and talk about in more detail. First, you used a great word, colonization. Removing language removes power from a people, and that's the first agenda item of colonization. And historically, is take the language away, right? And I remember from our reading last week, the introductory reading, talked a little bit about medical colonization too, and how there's a kind of when you go in to see somebody with more education than you about something going on in your body, it's very easy to have your own story translated into another language that actually doesn't make sense to you and is largely meaningless. And so that the idea of colonization is I think it's more dynamic than we're used to thinking about, and it happens every day in the health field as well. Um, you also mentioned that question of, who has the power to speak and who pays what for speaking, which is such a great point, especially for a poem that where the speaker has just so much gusto by the end. She really fully embodies that I voice. It goes from this, you know, uh, uh, I is the total black, lowercase b, being spoken from the earth's inside, to this place of I am black, capital B, because I come from the earth's inside. Real power in that I voice as she's claiming her own language, her own identity, her own survival, really. And then you pointed us to poetry is not a luxury. And you said, we hold words like jewels, like Taonga, so we can't forget them. And it reminded me of this great line there. Poetry is the way we give name to the nameless so it can be thought. And when the thought becomes an idea, the idea can become an action. And this is how change is built. These strings of jewels that we put out there together. Thank you so much for that gorgeous response. I love the idea that we have to hold on to these ideas. We have to have something to hold on to so that real change can happen. If I'm always thinking about how studying narrative medicine or studying stories just in general, how they bring us back to an ethic, how they teach us how we should live in the world. And it's never one thing. It's never one kind of rule. But I think that when we start thinking in this way, we start getting closer to that ethical place. How can we be open? How can we hold these words in our minds in an open way, or hold these poems or hold these stories in an open way so that change can actually happen? Whether it's by amplifying voices or by actively working on their behalf. Just absolutely beautiful response. Thank you so much. Um, so I know that we could probably talk forever about this poem. I'll try to wrap it up. I wanted to run something by you, just as a problem that I tend to have in pain science. And you have such a unique perspective as a physiotherapist, somebody who's rooted in pain science, but also somebody who does a lot of this social and emotional work as well. I thought you'd be a great person for me to ask. So I find that one thing that I come up against a lot when I'm working with people in pain science about narrative medicine is the urge to educate people about the wrong metaphors that they're using. You already know where I'm going. It's a problem, right? It's a real,
Yeah, it's a real problem.
like if I talk to somebody steeped in pain science and I say, I've got this knot in my shoulder, probably the first thing they're going to say is there's no such thing as a knot in your shoulder. That doesn't exist. Here's what's really happening between your nervous system and your brain in this area. And here's, and they'll walk me through it, in a very hopeful and empowering way to show me how that symbol is I'm using is wrong and is holding me back. And so I think usually they're doing it to try to, help me see things differently. But I think something might be getting lost. I feel like the urge to correct might be getting in the way of curiosity. And I just wanted to know if that's something you experience too. How do you stay curious with your patients? What's a different approach?
$500,000 question, and the question that the pain science and
Right.
this separates the pain community too, right? And I mean, I think there's so many other examples in the world, which of course now I can't think of, where you would never try to find someone whose beliefs are sitting over here and go, oh no, 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 they should be over here, and try and do that in a 20-minute book. It's just so it's impossible. And so there's sort of two ways that I think of it. I mean, I think often people don't even know the stories they're telling themselves. So some of it is so social. And so there was this terrible ad in like maybe in like the late 80s where it was an arthritis campaign, and they had this female with all these bits of glass like, sticking out of it, and it was, I'm sure it was a very active and very successful fundraising campaign because it was such an image. And I'm sure there are now people my age and older who think of that every time they meet it. This is damage, there's all this, so people don't know that. So my strategy is, I would say now my strategy is I can definitely think of times where I've just gone, oh, they need the pain talk, and it never works, which is probably why I've found myself where I do now. So I think for a lot of people, it's about saying, because often they don't yet have a diagnosis, and maybe they might not get one. So that actually, let's look at the bits that you do have agency over and the bits that you have control over, and how the pain is impacting all of your life. So I would always look for the story that they are telling, because you have to enter that story with them. Like I said before, there's they'll often have a metaphor. They'll talk about it dialing up here or dialing down, or whatever it might be. But I tend to do it visually, so I'll whiteboard or post-its, or and then this is what the medication does, and that makes me sleepy, and then my sleep gets mucked up, and then I'm grumpy, and then so and so fights with so and so, and then I don't want to go to work, and my teacher, it's hard to go to school because I can't take my medicine, and my teacher doesn't get it, and so there's all these bits, and the story that they're telling themselves about how those bits all fit together, and you can line them up, and they're literally, in their own words, they've said, when I don't sleep well, my pain is worse the next day. And it's like, well, do you think that's because of the tissue that's in your knee? What? Let's have a think about that. Like, how does that change that? Is being worried about the test that you've got today, or and in pediatrics, you see the pain has a really typical fluctuation for a school year. Big flare, and it's like week 2 when they go back and they completely overcook it. Then all the anxious kids, their pain's worse, in the month before exams. Like there's this kind of natural flux, and it's more obvious because all the children are going through their stress cycle at the same time, whereas adults, we're all overlapping. It's a bit messy. And so I think that being able to actually show them their story, that like you've just told me that you can, so what do you reckon? What's that about? And then, okay, and actually metaphors, the metaphor I often use is a necklace. Like, if your necklace is all knotted, you just find a spot. Just start there. Just start, like, if it's I can get up at the same time every day, then that's what it is. That's where you start. And that actually moving someone from one way of thinking that they've done most of their life, and then to a different way in one, like, can you imagine a psychologist attempting to do that about any kind of really entrenched thought? It's like a seed, and then it goes from there. Yeah, I think it's difficult, but it happens from listening, and that they will tell you. I've always been really interested in how people chuck it out, like smokers. They always go, yeah, I know, I should stop smoking. And they sort of just put it out there, and then they kind of put it back in. And it's like, do you know, they don't need a lecture. They need yeah, that is something to keep on your radar.
Yeah. Listening to your approach reminds me, people are always asking me for like the method of narrative medicine, like when you talk to a patient, here are the steps you should take so that they feel heard. And I'm like, oh gosh, I have no idea. Like there aren't any steps to this thing. But there is one really important part, I think, of the patient provider exchange that you've just honed in on, is show them their story. And it's not even a part of the patient provider exchange. It's a part of the friend, human exchange. When somebody comes to you with a problem, it's great to be able to repeat it back to them and say, here's what I think I heard. did I get it right? You know, like
Yeah.
just getting your words reflected back to you can be a really powerful sign that you're being heard, but also may shift something, you know, in the way that it's reflected to you, that you actually you hear your own words in a different way. And from there you
Mm,
keep the conversation going, like, you know, here's what I heard. I also you heard this word repeated many times. I want to hear what that word means to you. Or I noticed you used, you know, the past tense a lot when you talked about this. Can you tell me more about, you know, how this is maybe something you've experienced in the past? Are you still really feeling it now? You know, you can mine it, but it always begins with that general observation. Here's what I think you said. Did I get it right? You know,
yeah.
and that's really what you just described. Um, I think that's just a beautiful.
By accident. But also, I mean, your pain is invisible. It's the one, it's lonely and you can't see it. And you know, we've talked about the whole, you know, I just wish I was in a wheelchair. I wish I had a cast on my leg and someone would know that there was a problem. And you
Right.
know, people with chronic long-term pain, it's invisible. People can't see it. So showing them that you've heard their story, that you come as close to understanding. I mean, of course you don't, but showing them their story shows that you've seen it. It's as close to feeling their pain as they're ever going to get.
Mhm.
Um, and I think we owe our patients that if we can do nothing else, we can listen to it.
Thank you so much, Fiona. I just want to land on that beautiful note. Um, this has been such a wonderful, productive call. I'm really grateful to you for making it work this week. I know you're in the middle of a busy work day still. So thank you for joining me and bringing your wisdom and experience as a physiotherapist, a researcher, and a writer to this conversation. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining the Bridge podcast, where medicine meets the arts. It's my fun new tagline. Next week, we will turn to perspective and bias. If this week asked how figurative language carries meaning across to another person, next week we will ask what lenses do we bring to that exchange and how do they shape how we hear stories in the first place? Thanks again, Fiona. We'll see you soon.
Yeah.